This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. I'm going to start today's episode with a claim that might sound self-congratulatory, but really isn't. It is also far from my intuitive daily experience living as a middle-class Londoner during the worst cost of living crisis in my lifetime. But it is true and it is striking. The claim is this: I am incredibly wealthy. I've never been hungry for a full day. I rarely ever shiver throughout the night. I still have all my teeth except the wisdom tooth that was causing a lot of discomfort. My food supplier, called a supermarket, is constantly advertising me culinary products from 6 continents. And my pocket device gives me access to more books and films than even the best supplied physical libraries ever did. But most importantly, I am also able to plan for children with the knowledge that I am unlikely to have to bury them myself. Now, all of this is very remarkable on historical terms. Even 150 years ago, it would have been very rare for even British aristocrats to be able to share almost any of these conditions with me. And yet, I am not special for a Western millennial. This raises the obvious question of how did this happen? On the other hand, it also raises the less glorious question of why not everywhere? Why so much wealth accumulated in particular pockets of the world geography? To understand the human condition today, we need to understand our economic origins. And my guest today attempts to do just that. Oded Galor is an economist at Brown University. He is an eminent figure in the field, famous for the so-called unified growth theory, something that attempts to explain the economics of both present-day nation-states and prehistoric tribes under one, unified theory. For a long time, unified growth theory was relatively inaccessible to those without education in economics, but then came Galor's book, Journey of Humanity, written in a remarkably slim format to the general public. I love the book, and I was really quite honored when Galor accepted the invitation to come discuss it on the show. Our conversation was stretched across 2 sessions, totaling well over 2 hours, so I decided to publish them in 2 parts. This is the first installment, and it explains the basic insight of the unified growth theory by answering the question of wealth. How is it that me and so many others can live with such historically unique access to food, heat, and technology? The second episode will explore global inequalities, explore the reason why this fortune has fallen upon so many in countries from Finland to England and from Singapore to South Korea, but not to billions in the global south. And how can the unified growth theory help poor and middle-income countries catch up? That will be a conversation about colonialism, industrial revolution, and much more. As always, the show notes has a full list of names and technical terms mentioned in the conversation. I hope that you enjoyed the episode. I bring to you Oded Galor.
Professor Oded Galor, welcome to the podcast.
It is wonderful to be on your podcast.
So your book, The Journey of Humanity, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality, is wonderfully ambitious in its titling. And it really does, I think, speak to 2 kinds of readers. On the one hand, those who are interested in this kind of journey of humanity, the kind of macro history, people who may be used to reading books by Jared Diamond, Yuval Noah Harari, maybe David Graeber. On the other hand, it is also a book about economics. It's a book by an eminent economist, which draws on a lot of very nuanced economic research. Maybe they're speaking more to the kinds of readers who are used to reading Robert Solow, Daron Acemoglu, Thomas Piketty, perhaps. And I like this combination, but why wouldn't you start by explaining why are these both themes such that you want to discuss about them in the same book? Why should those who are used to reading economics care about the journey of humanity, this grand story? And why should those who are really interested in this kind of grand arc of humanity, why should they be interested in economics?
So that's a wonderful question. And one of the fundamental theses that I'm advancing in my book, in The Journey of Humanity, is that to a large extent, in order to understand the roots of wealth and inequality in the world today, we have to understand the entire journey of humanity. Namely, the conviction behind the book is that in order to understand the roots of inequality today, one has to focus on events that occurred hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and even tens of thousands of years ago. And in fact, the journey of humanity is inseparable from the roots of inequality in the wealth of nations.
You structure the book in an interesting way. It has 2 parts. One trying to decode the mystery of growth. Why and how did we get as rich as we have, especially in the past 200 years? On the other hand, how did we get so unequal as we have during the past 200 years again? And I think here I could hear a critic saying that, well, we certainly are richer now that we were in the past, and there certainly is a lot of inequality, but there's really no reason to focus just on this kind of the past 200 years being in some interesting way really different. You could see people saying, well, the Romans were richer than the Etruscans, and they were richer than some hunter-gatherers who used to live there before them. And inequality is natural. It's always been with us. Ramses II was probably richer than the slaves working for the pyramids. And so why don't you give us a little argument, a thesis for why is the past 200 years in any sense really different from what has always been taking place when it comes to wealth and inequality?
So the viewpoint that I'm advancing is that if we focus on the journey of humanity in the past 300,000 years, namely the journey that was originated with the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago, there are two fundamental mysteries that surround this journey. One of them may be defined as the mystery of growth, namely, what are the roots of this dramatic transformation in living standards that occurred in the past 200 years after literally hundreds of thousands of years of stagnation? Or to put it differently, why is it the case that in the past 200 years, income per capita in the world economy increased by a factor of 14, whereas over most of human existence, income per capita has nearly remained stable and perhaps increased by a factor of 1/2. And the second mystery, as I said earlier, is the mystery of inequality. Namely, what are the origins of this vast inequality in the wealth of nations? Why some countries are so rich and others are so poor? And why do we see this tremendous increase in the inequality in the wealth of nations in the past 200 years? Now, when you think about the mystery of growth, it is quite apparent based on the evidence that despite the fact that technological progress advanced gradually in the course of human history, this progress was not converted into more prosperous people. It was converted predominantly into more people. So over most of human existence, the forces that are governing the evolution of human societies are the Malthusian forces. When technology advances, it generates a temporary increase in the standard of living, as we see, for instance, in the Greco-Roman period, but this is not long-lasting. Ultimately, this increase in resources permit more children to survive, permit more children to be born, and consequently, income per capita is reverting back to the previous equilibrium position. So in contrast to the views of some, that in fact, since the Neolithic Revolution, we see a gradual improvement in living standards over the planet as a whole, what in fact we see is a gradual improvement in the level of technology, but no change in the standard of living that is long-lasting.
You have some wonderful data around this. You say that estimates suggest that wages for a workday were around 7 kilograms of wheat grains in Babylon, 5 kilograms in the Assyrian Empire, and this is more than 3,000 years ago, 11 to 15 kilograms in Athens, 4 kilograms in Egypt, and even in the verge of the Industrial Revolution, you're in Amsterdam, you get 10 kilograms for a workday. You're in Paris, you get 5. You're in Madrid or Naples, you get 3 to 4. So there really doesn't seem to be much of a difference in which of these epochs you're living in terms of how much you get for your work a day.
Indeed. So that's an accurate characterization of the evolution of human societies. We do not see much differences in the standard of living over time or across space. What we see are differences in population densities. Namely, societies that are more advanced technologically tend to be more densely populated than otherwise. So this is a striking difference from today's world, in which naturally technologically advanced societies are the most prosperous societies. In the past, technologically advanced societies had larger population, but largely not richer population.
And then what about inequality? There's always been inequality, even from the data that I just read. Sometimes you get 3 kilograms of wheat, sometimes you get 11, depending on where you are in history and geographically where you happen to be working. has there really been a dramatic, in any sense, a new phase when it comes to the history of inequality during the past 200 years, or is it just the same old story?
No, there is a huge increase in inequality across nations in the past 200 years. So if you focus, for instance, on the year 1800, the beginning of the 19th century, and you focus on the ratio of income per capita in the richest regions of the world, and you compare it to the income per capita in the poorest regions of the world, the ratio at the time is about 3 to 1. But if you look at the world today, or the world in the past 20 years, this ratio increased to a magnitude of 15 to 1, 20 to 1, and even 100 to 1, depending on how you define regions. Namely, there is enormous divergence that is taking place in the past 200 years, and this divergence is associated with this takeoff from stagnation to growth. Namely, when the world is escaping from the Malthusian trap, and on average, income per capita in the world is increasing by a factor of 14. This increase in prosperity is not shared universally across the globe. Some societies are taking off early, others much later, and consequently an enormous divergence is occurring in the world economy.
Your book's second part deals with this divergence and the consequent inequality. But why don't we start by unpacking a little bit the first part of your book, which really starts from the very origins of anatomically modern humans and ends with the post-industrial growth regime. You already mentioned some of the key terms of your thesis here. You mentioned Malthusian forces. Perhaps the most important thing, if I read this first part of your book correctly, is the idea that in some sense, the change towards a wealthier humanity has been very abrupt, but it has been very abrupt in a way that is a consequence of very gradual processes that have been operating for a long time. Would that be a correct characterization?
That's a perfectly accurate characterization. Indeed, there is a process that is evolving, if you wish, beneath the surface. And this process is a gradual process. And once this process is reaching a tipping point, we see very dramatic transformation in the standard of living in the world economy. So to a large extent, you can view it as a phase transition. So what is happening in the course of human history is that economies are being governed by what I define as the wheels of change. And these wheels of change consist of the technological level, the size of the human population, and the degree of adaptation of the human population. And these three wheels of change are reinforcing one another in the course of human history. So we start with a modest population of humans in Africa 300,000 years ago. And sooner or later, given the capacity of the human brain to innovate, this population is able to make some progress in terms of technology. Now, naturally, this is not the pace of progress that we see today. This is basically a movement from one stone technology to another stone tool technology. But nevertheless, these changes in the technology that humans possess at the time permits more humans to be supported, and in addition, permits the adaptation of the human population to the technological environment. And in turn, the size of the human population and the adaptation of the human population is contributing to further technological progress. So in the course of human history, we see this reinforcing cycle. More people, faster technological progress, progress, more people and more adaptable people. Now, the process is very slow at any point in time, but nevertheless, over a 300,000 year period, we reach a stage in which the pace of technological progress is so rapid that in order to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment, individuals must start to invest in their education. Parents start to invest in the education of their children, but in fact, they have very limited budgets. They live very close to the subsistence level of consumption, and in order to afford investment in education, they must economize on another item on their budget constraint. They cannot economize on their consumption, and as a result of it, they reduce the number of children. And it is this decline in fertility that permits the growth process to be freed from the counterbalancing effect of population and permits the world to sail into the sustained growth regime.
There's a lot there to unpack. Maybe we can bracket the point of human adaptation for now. I think it's one which is very easy to misunderstand. and focus first on the two other wheels of change, which are the population growth and technological advancement. So what you're saying is that there is a gradual, constant improvement in human technology. This is what marks our species in a way, our humongous brain and the consequent capacity to constantly develop new tools, better technologies.
Indeed.
And for a short period of time, yes, this makes the people who figured out this new technology a bit better off, but that eventually means less of them children will be dying of starvation, and therefore they will have more children to sustain, and eventually this population growth will kind of eat away the extra income that might have been produced. You have some good data around this. You have some data, for example, from Ireland, how the potato, when it was introduced in Ireland, first led to a lot more income available, then led to a population boom in Ireland, and therefore the income per capita actually ends up coming back to where it was before the potato. You have similar data around maize in China. What would be your favorite data point to make this Malthusian claim?
So again, I think that the example of Ireland is a fantastic one, because it shows us how the importation of this crop from the New World into Europe and ultimately into Ireland generated an enormous population boom. I mean, the population in Ireland increases by a factor of 4, almost 5, over a 200-year period, but we do not see much improvement in the standard of living. So we see a better technology, a better crop that is suitable for the soil that existed in Ireland. And this crop is ultimately permitting more people to be sustained, but it does not make them more prosperous than otherwise. And then what is interesting in the context of the Ireland case is that we see, in fact, the reverse process as well. At a certain point, we see the potato blight that is affecting the crops in Ireland. And this destruction in this new technology is generating the Irish famine, mass starvation, and exodus of enormous population from Ireland into England and into the New World. So this is a sort of a classical Malthusian fluctuation: better technology, more people, not more prosperous people; destruction of technology, less people, again, as well off as they were before. And as you mentioned, I mean, we can think about it in the context of the implementation of maize in China too. And it is quite apparent that those regions of China that implemented the maize first generated an enormous population increase, but without any effect on the standard of living over this time period. And an additional piece of evidence is basically cross-country evidence, where it is quite apparent that when you look at the effect of better technology on income per capita, we do not see any effect. But when we look at the effect of better technology on population density, the effect is tremendously positive.
And at some point, this dynamic changes. You have an interesting way, I guess, of both being rediscovering Thomas Malthus as someone who actually was quite right as a thinker, the British intellectual who was rather pessimistic about the future of humanity. He thought that this mechanism that is now named after him would always bring humans back towards subsistence. And you kind of, and he's been forgotten to some extent. Not necessarily forgotten, but he's this kind of a classic, well, he wasn't quite right, kind of a character. And what I hear you saying is that, well, he was 100% right until his own time, when everything suddenly changed, and then he was 100% wrong ever after.
Yeah, that's perfectly accurate. I mean, so it's quite ironic. I mean, he was perfectly right about the way that economic forces operated up till the time when he wrote the book. But quite ironically, immediately after the conclusion of the writing of his book, the world, in fact, started to change quite dramatically, and economies started to escape from what we define today as a Malthusian trap.
And I guess that will be an important theme that we should now soon start talking about how did how did we escape this trap? And you already mentioned that education plays a big part in it. But before we go there, I wanted to raise this quite, I think, a fascinating idea that you mentioned in the book. One of these big kind of theme in a lot of books titled with similar titles as Journey of Humanity is this question of why did we start producing food with agricultural methods, where it seems to be that it led to a worse diet, led to perhaps, certainly worse teeth, but in many ways it led into a worse situation for the average human than hunting and gathering. This is what Jared Diamond famously calls perhaps the worst mistake in human history. And it's kind of a mystery that everybody, I think, in the field has their own favorite explanation for why and how did agriculture become so prevalent, even if hunting and gathering seem to have served the individuals just fine. And you you use this Malthusian thinking to explain or give one possible way in which how this might have happened. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So it's very important to understand the evidence because, as you said, some popular writers such as Jared Diamond and Yuval Harari discuss this issue, and they do refer to potentially to the worst mistake in human history. And in fact, I think that the evidence are not necessarily supportive of this, and there is a very simple way to reconcile between the transition to agriculture and rationality. So let me try to explain it. So first about the evidence. So we do have evidence that based on skeletal remain that in fact hunter-gatherers thousands of years before the Neolithic Revolution lived longer, worked perhaps less stressfully than otherwise, and suffered from less infectious diseases than Neolithic farmers. And then, as you said, Jared Diamond and Harari both raised the question, if this is the case, why humans are moving into the Neolithic Revolution. And they have different arguments, and I think that the arguments are in fact both incorrect. And the reason is very simple. So what is happening over this time period is humans are 60 to 90,000 years ago, escaping Africa and starting to populate the world. And gradually they occupy every niche that exists on planet Earth. So initially, when niches are unoccupied, they can simply wander around and explore and exploit a particular niche. And when the exploitation is over, move to an additional niche. But at a certain point, because of these resources, the population on planet Earth is increasing gradually, and there are no more free niches to be occupied. And consequently, humans start to bang into one another. Namely, hunter-gatherer tribes are not free to explore without basically competing with other hunter and gatherers. So gradually in this process, we see a gradual decline in the standard of living. There are less territories to explore, and consequently, the average resources per person are declining gradually. And then we reach a point in which, in the absence of the transition to agriculture, in fact, we would see mass extinction of the human population because, again, planet Earth cannot support so many people using hunting and gathering technologies. And what humans have discovered at this point in time is that they can move into agriculture, they can domesticate plants and animals, and they can extract from each acre of land nearly 100 times more than hunter-gatherers can extract from this acre of land. So they move to agriculture, as I said, in order to be in a better position to support a larger population. Now, the generation that makes the transition, or the generations that are making the transition, are as well off as the earlier generations. But when you look at the data and you compare what existed 3,000 years before the Neolithic Revolution and the Neolithic Revolution, you see a sharp drop. But in fact, if you would have more observation along the line, you will see that there was a gradual decline in living standard. And at the time of the transition, individuals were perfectly rational. In fact, in the absence of this transition, they would face mass extinction. And in human ingenuity is saving humanity from this mass extinction. So others, for instance, suggested that this was simply a mistake. And once people realized that this is a mistake, they forgot how to hunt and gather efficiently, and therefore they did not return. This appears completely false from the viewpoint of an economist. People are rational, people are not forgetful, and in fact, they cannot return to agriculture because agriculture cannot support the enormous population that is present on planet Earth once the transition to agriculture is taking place. The size of the human population is enormous. If people will revert back to hunting and gathering, there would be mass extinction of the human population. It's not rational. So, as I said, this was not the worst mistake in human history. This was a classical case in which human ingenuity is saving humanity from an enormous extinction.
However, because of the Malthusian logic, it does not give people more. It just gives the land more people.
Indeed. So precisely. So the Malthusian forces are operating. We are moving into we're having a better technology that supports more people, not richer people. And then the process is not reversible because, in fact, hunting and gathering cannot support these enormous people that are being generated by the Neolithic revolution.
We cannot go back to the Garden of Eden.
Indeed.
Well, this brings us then to the point of Malthus was wrong until this brings us then to the point of Thomas Malthus being 100% right before he was 100% wrong. Something dramatic changes around the 1700s, 1800s transition when he also lived. What happens and why is this not just a story of the steam engine happening and us being able to harness the energy in fossil fuels and therefore having such an abundance of surplus that no amount of population growth can take it away from us? What happens in your view, and why is it not as simple as that?
Yeah, so as I said, what we see over this time period is a phase transition. So let's think about a phase transition that we are all familiar with that occurs in nature, the transition from liquid to gas. So if we heat water in a kettle, and initially we do not see a change in the phase of the water. In fact, they remain liquid. But then as we continue the process and the water temperature reaches a critical threshold, typically 100 degrees Celsius, then we see the transition from water to gas. And this is a very abrupt process. So there is a gradual buildup up to the critical point, and beyond the critical point, we see a phase transition. Now, the same occurs in the course of human history. As I said earlier, we start with a modest population in Africa. This modest population innovates. Innovation supports more people innovate more than otherwise. And this reinforcing interaction is ultimately generating sufficiently rapid technological progress to which individuals must respond, in the sense that the environment is changing so rapidly that human capital or education becomes essential for the ability of individuals to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment. Why is this critical? Because investment in human capital is costly. In order to invest in the education of your children, you must economize on other elements in your budget constraint, namely, you must economize on the number of children. And this is critical because it suggests to us that this level of technological progress is ultimately converted into richer people rather than into more people.
And I guess here would be a good time to then return to the point I promised that we will return, which is your point of human adaptation. Could you explain, what do you mean by this third wheel of change? So we talked about population growth, we talked about technological development. What do you mean by human adaptation in this context? I mean, the term is very familiar to many from Darwinian biology, but what do you mean in this context?
So when I refer to human adaptation, I'm referring to the adaptation of first, it's very important to note, this is the adaptation of the human population as a whole. You can think about it in the context of, say, the adaptation of human beings to the agricultural revolution. And some of this adaptation is in the context of, say, the acquisition of the ability to digest lactose in adulthood. Or we can see it in the context of the African population, the development of natural immunity to malaria. Or we can see it in the context of gluten tolerance, etc. So humans are gradually adapting to the environment in which they operate, and consequently, further technological progress can be made to exploit this adaptation of the human population. So humans are simply adjusting to the technological environment that is taking place, and this adaptation is permitting further technological progress that can capitalize on this adaptation.
And I think importantly, you don't just mean biological adaptation, you also talk about cultural changes.
it is predominantly cultural adaptation. It can be partly biological, but as I said, this is something that is experienced by the world as a whole. It's not an explanation. It's an explanation for why at a certain point humanity is able to take off from stagnation to growth. It's not an explanation for why do we see inequality across the globe. This is a process that is common to all humans. Humans are adapting to their geographical niches, whatever they are. And this adaptation, as I said, is predominantly cultural. And this cultural adaptation is permitting people to perform better than otherwise.
And I guess here is then the question, why do we need this third wheel of change? Why not just talk about the Malthusian logic, population growth, taking away any extra surplus we have?
Because we want to be more accurate with respect to the way that humanity evolved. I mean, certainly in terms of explaining the transition from stagnation to growth, I could have focused entirely on the interaction between the scale of the population and technological progress. This would generate a transition and would generate the same type of insights. But nevertheless, what we see in the course of human history is that societies are evolving in a way that permits them to adjust and adapt to the environment in which they live. And this adaptation is very important because it provides societies with tools that allows them to perform better given the environment in which they operate.
And would the cultural shift towards having less children and invest more in the education of each children be an example of such a cultural adaptation that was conducive to growth?
Yes, certainly. I mean, so certainly when you realize that in fact you live in an environment in which gradually the return to human capital is higher than otherwise, then you can adapt in this context, and people are changing their preferences. They prioritize investments in education over the number of children, and consequently, this is a cultural adaptation that reinforces the process. As I said, it's not necessarily a first-order element. It's a reinforcing element that is very important for the understanding of the process as a whole, and it's very important for the understanding of important cultural adaptation that occurred in the course of human history.
Now, it makes sense when we look at the world today and the world 200-300 years ago to say that, yes, nowadays when people get rich, they don't invest that typically in having extra children. But there seems to be something difficult in this story, at least at first glance, because what people typically know about this Industrial Revolution period, the 1800s especially, if they don't know anything else, they've seen these graphs of maybe fossil fuels spiking, but especially population growth, this dramatic population growth that has taken place in the last 200 years. And so how is it? I mean, it seems to be something ironic, at least, if we are explaining the escape from the Malthusian mechanism with the taking away of the rapid population growth as a mechanism. But then we are applying this to a period which sees the most rapid population growth in human history. So if a skeptic would come with this argument, what would be your response?
Yes, so the argument is quite straightforward. So this interaction between population and technology is bringing about an enormous increase in the size of the human population on the one hand, and enormous increase in the pace of technological progress. So if you think about the time period since the Neolithic Revolution until the Industrial Revolution, this is about 12,000 year period. The size of the world population in the eve of the Neolithic Revolution is about 2.5 million people. The size of the human population in the early phases of industrialization is about 1 billion people. Namely, the size of the world population is increasing 400-fold despite being in a Malthusian epoch. What permits us, as we said earlier, is acceleration in technological progress. So we moved from stone tool technology that existed, say, 300,000 years ago to steam engine technology in the eve of the Industrial Revolution. And it is this change in technology that permits an enormous increase in the size of the world population. Now, we reach a point in which there is a race between technology and population. And technological progress becomes so rapid that biological reproduction is not sufficiently rapid to keep pace with this process. And this is what I defined as the post-Malthusian regime. Namely, we reach a point in which technology is advancing so rapidly and population growth is very, very rapid. Nevertheless, since biological reproduction is a lengthy process, technology has the upper hand, and we start to see the growth in income per capita. But this is not sustained economic growth because, in fact, much of it, 2/3 of it, or 4/5 of it, is consumed by the increase in the size of the human population. And it is the demographic transition that occurs, say, in Western Europe in the 1870s that frees the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population. And despite the fact that the world population in absolute level is increasing dramatically, the rate of population growth declines dramatically. The rate of technological progress is enormous. And consequently, we see this enormous growth, 14-fold increase in income per capita in the past 200 years.
So would it be correct then to say that the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the early 1800s, there the question is mostly about just suddenly being able to produce so much surplus that the population growth is not able to consume it all? And then post 1870 in Western Europe and post more recent times in other parts of the world, there we really have a new phase where the Malthusian forces are no more existing because of the new way that families are planning their children's numbers and education.
Indeed, that's precisely right.
Okay, great. Well, this relates to a lot of topics we could talk about. I guess one of them would be there is a certain gloomy picture of what the Industrial Revolution was like. It was about child exploitation, child labor, horrible living conditions. You're kind of painting a somewhat different picture where it was a period where education of children, for example, became at the forefront of both the economic world and policymaking world. How much was Industrial Revolution about a Dickensian child exploitation versus how much was it about a Oded Galorian emphasis on education and the family planning later on, and therefore prosperity for all?
So I think that the view is changing in this respect, and I think that my viewpoint of the world is gaining dominance. And what we see is that, yes, I mean, there are certain elements of the Industrial Revolution that are associated with exploitation of children and perhaps smoke and pollution. But to a large extent, the Industrial Revolution is the age of progress. And we should not view the Industrial Revolution as industry per se. We should view it as an era, the age of progress, age in which, in fact, ideas are being transformed, technologies are being transformed, and consequently, ultimately, we see for the first time in human history the decline in child labor, and ultimately, we see the emergence of mass education that did not exist earlier. So child labor was a constant phenomenon in the course of human history. It's not unique to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, it was really taking a particular form. But ultimately, as we see in the course of what we defined as the Industrial Revolution, and what I would like to define as the age of progress, is that ultimately child labor is being abolished, or it is gradually fading precisely over this time period.
And you make the case that actually it was the industrialists themselves that were lobbying for public education.
Indeed. So that's very interesting. So naturally, at a certain point, when technological progress is accelerating, there is a large demand for human capital, for educated people that can cope. And it was this rapidly changing technological environment. Now, parents, being responsible as they may be, most of them are too poor to invest in the education of their children. And consequently, industrialists realize that this is the time in which, in fact, investment in education can sustain their profit rates. If you think about the Marxian viewpoint of the world, Marx is suggesting to us that capital accumulation is going to lead into competition across capitalists, exploitation, and ultimately into a class struggle because the workers will have nothing to lose but their chains. But what we see in reality is that capitalists realize sooner or later that the only way to sustain their profit rates is, in fact, to assure that their labor force is more educated than otherwise. They cannot invest in the education of their workers directly because workers can simply cross the street and move into a different firm and their investment will be lost. And consequently, they lobby in the British Parliament quite aggressively to assure that public education is being enacted. And they're in fact behind the Education Act of 1870 and ultimately behind the Balfour Act of 1902, in which in England, education became compulsory, universal, and free.
But that would suggest, wouldn't it, that it would be those places that are most industrial that have the most investment in public education. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my gut reaction is to say that France, for example, was leading the way to public education in Europe, not Britain, and not necessarily from an industrialist point of view, maybe more from a nation building point of view. How do you think through that point?
Indeed. So I do not suggest that industrialization is occurring in England first, because England is more educated than other nations in continental Europe. That's not the case. What I'm suggesting is that in England, there are certain conditions that are ripe for industrialization. And once industrialization is taking place, industrialists realize that in order to remain competitive, they have to start to invest in the education of their children. And that's when the process starts. So in fact, we see massive investment in education in England much later than we see in continental Europe. But this is a response to the industrialization that is taking place in England. In continental Europe, education initially is motivated by other reasons. It has to do with social cohesiveness, nation building, military needs of their bureaucracy, etc.
Okay, well, if I understand correctly, the basic picture then is that with industrialization, we start to experience this new need for human capital, for education of the workforce, meaning our children, and therefore families start to reduce the amount of children that they get. One of the historic points that might be used as a counter argument against this is China. So China has a very long tradition of not public education, but private education, of social mobility being linked to education, of a millennium of civil servants being taken in by exams, and therefore a pretty strong cultural current which pushes parents to invest in their education. Now, it's also associated with a culture of wealthy men having a lot of concubines, and producing as much offspring almost as possible, partially at least led by the cultural need to have male offspring. But do you think that China is a counter example to this, because there you don't seem to have a kind of pre-modern emphasis on education being coupled with this reduction of family size?
Right. So some of these forces of what we define today as the quantity-quality trade-off are operating in China, but they are not broad-based in the sense that there is no mass participation in this process, and consequently it doesn't have an effect that can generate a movement into a sustained growth regime. And in addition, China has other limitations that prevent an early transition from stagnation to growth.
I think that talking about China can serve as a great bridge towards the second part of your book, which deals with the origins of inequality, especially inequality between nations. We all know that China is inequality. This was the first part of my conversation with Oded Galor. Stay tuned for part 2. Thank you as always for listening. Take care.